You should give us your living space. It's too cramped with 3 kids. My husband and I were shocked by the unreasonable demands of the sister-in-law, who suddenly appeared with her children at the 2-family house where we lived with the in-laws. Faced with our loss for words, the in-laws also sided with the sister-in-law. The place you two are living in is too big for just the 2 of you, isn't it? It's only natural as a human being to give it up for this girl here with 3 growing children. You two would be fine in a storeroom. Frustrated with their unreasonable demands, my patience snapped. I could no longer bear it. I decided internally that I must mete out divine punishment to them for their selfish behavior. With an expressionless face, I replied, "Understood. As you wish, my husband and I will leave this place." Saying only that, I took my husband's hand and moved from the multi-family house to a modest apartment. A few days after the move, I received a call on my smartphone from the sister-in-law and answered it impulsively. What pierced my ears was the sister-in-law's yelling voice, sounding desperate. "What's going on?" "I got a call from the real estate agent telling us to vacate." "You know something, don't you?" "What did you do?" "My revenge against those who took over our home was." "My name is Hillary. I live with my husband Steve, and I'm a remote worker in my 30s. The way I met my husband was through an arranged meeting. Having worked from home for a long time before getting married, I had no chance to meet men, which worried my parents enough to secretly set up the meeting for me. Initially, I was perplexed by this meddling, but the man I met at the meeting turned out to be surprisingly pleasant. We hit it off over common interests, and soon our relationship developed into marriage. My husband, while a bit timid, is a kind person and has qualities that I often described as rigid and inflexible, lack. Our married life has been going smoothly. His parents live in the town next to ours. Although we don't live with them, we occasionally receive calls or are invited to their house, maintaining a fairly good relationship. A few years after our marriage, the mother-in-law started suggesting that we live together. We're getting older, and I'm getting anxious about the future. "Hey, if you guys don't mind, why don't we live together?" She said this casually, but afterward, the in-laws frequently brought up the topic of living together. The idea of living with the elderly couple was understandable. And since we had a good relationship, living together might be a good idea. I was open to the idea, but my husband seemed to have some reservations. "Steve, are you against living with your parents?" "No, I think it'll be okay." His indecisive attitude was typical, so I didn't think much of it. Little did I know that this would lead to such a situation. One day, when we were living peacefully, I was struck by a tragedy. Shockingly, my parents died in a traffic accident. It was so sudden that I could only be stunned. Being an only child with no close cousins or relatives to rely on, I had to arrange the funeral without time to mourn. Since my grandparents were also gone, I inherited all my parents' assets. This included a significant amount of money and the family home and land. Despite the sadness and the busyness of dealing with my parents' affairs, I couldn't truly rejoice over the inheritance. My kind husband supported me throughout this time, wrapping me in his care. The in-laws, too, empathized with me, who couldn't openly express my feelings. "Hillary, it's okay to cry when you're sad. It's impossible not to be sad after suddenly losing your blood-related parents. I know there's a lot to do, but you need to accept your feelings first." Reminded by the mother-in-law that I hadn't cried since my parents' death, I finally allowed myself to cry my heart out. After the funeral and inheritance matters settled down, the in-laws, who had been keeping an eye on me, began visiting more frequently and bringing gifts. "If it's bothersome, don't hesitate to say no, okay?" Although she laughed it off. I felt saved by the in-laws' genuine concern and began to see them as my true parents. Then, one day, while we were enjoying coffee and chatting at home, the topic of living together came up again after a long while. Hey, about the living together thing we talked about before. Hillary, you must feel lonely having lost your parents. How about seriously considering living with us? We really want to live with you, Hillary. Of course, whenever you're ready, but could you start thinking about it seriously? Touched by the earnestness in their proposal, I felt a warmth in my heart. After they left, I discussed it with my husband, who had just returned from work. Your parents suggested living together again. I have to dispose of my parents' house anyway. So maybe it's a good opportunity to start living together in a new home built for that purpose. What do you think, Steve? Well, yes, I think that will be fine. Let's do that. Though he seemed concerned, my husband ultimately agreed to my wish. We then informed the in-laws of our desire to live together and began preparations for it. Due to concerns about the seismic stability of my inherited home, we decided to demolish it and build a new multi-family house on the same land to live with the in-laws. The demolition and construction were costly, but fortunately, they were covered by the inheritance from my parents, and a few months later, a new multi-family house, registered in my name, was completed. The in-laws were pleased with the new home, and I, relieved, began our new life living with them. Initially, living with the in-laws went smoothly. However, over time, I started to feel a coldness in their attitude towards us. Hillary, please don't vacuum at such an hour. It's too noisy. You're home all day, you can clean anytime. You need to be more considerate of us in your daily life. At first, there were many comments about the differences in our living rhythms and the noise we made. But gradually, the in-laws began to criticize and nag more about household chores. It's nice of you to invite us for dinner, but this meal is so cheap looking, isn't it? Make something more luxurious. Isn't your hospitality lacking? Really, what kind of upbringing did your parents give you? Their cold words pierced my heart. However, I took their criticisms as a reflection of my own inadequacies. They must be scolding me for my own good, I thought. With this in mind, I endured their harsh and thorny words. Even so, their sudden change from being kind and warm to this new attitude gradually started to depress me. When I confided this to my husband, it seemed he had some suspicions. I thought as much. No, Hillary, it's not your fault. You manage the house well even though you're busy with work, and you're the ideal wife for me. So, don't worry about what my parents say. My husband's smile and kind words healed my heart a bit, though he seemed unable to speak up or oppose his parents, leaving the fundamental issue unresolved. Gradually, the in-laws' neglect extended beyond words and attitudes, and they stopped contributing to the shared expenses for living and utilities that we had previously split. Both you and Steve work, so you have money, right? Isn't it terrible to expect us, who live on a pension, to pay? When did you become such ungrateful children? Faced with such accusations, we had no choice but to cover the expenses for the in-laws as well. Then, one day, a shocking event occurred. My husband cheated on me, so I divorced him out of anger. So, let us live here too. She said this as she brought her 3 young children to our home. My husband and I were baffled, but the in-laws welcomed them. This is your home too, so of course we won't turn you away. In fact, I'm thrilled to live with my grandchildren. Such a terrible husband to cheat. You must be tired, come in and rest first.
Yay!
Thank you. I'll be coming in then. Without seeking the consent of my husband and me, who were supposed to be living there too, the in-laws gleefully welcomed them in. It would have been one thing if it were just a visit, but to move them in without our consent. I hesitantly approached the mother-in-law. Mother. Suddenly living with the sister-in-law like this is a bit. Hearing this, the mother-in-law, perceiving that I was against living with the sister-in-law, glared at me and said coldly, "What? You want her, who was abandoned by her husband, to be lost on the streets? With such young children? How can you say such cold things? Are you even human?" She spat these words at me. I hurriedly tried to correct her, but she was not listening. "No, that's not what I meant, but, if we are going to live together, I just wish that we could have had some agreement." "What's the difference? You're just against living with them. After all, they will be living in our household space, so we don't need your consent. Don't interfere." With that, she slammed the door to their living space shut. Left behind. I was stunned by the sister-in-law and the in-laws' unreasonable behavior and arguments. The forced cohabitation with the sister-in-law and her children turned out to be a nightmare. Her kids would barge into our living space, running around and breaking things. No matter how many times I told them not to come into our room, they wouldn't listen. And asking the sister-in-law to intervene was fruitless. "What? Can you not interfere with my household? And don't scold my children without my permission." "I'm not scolding them. I just wish you would teach them some basic rules. Like not to roam around in someone else's living space or make noise in someone else's home. That's what I mean by you being arrogant. Living in our parents' house and acting like you own the place." She yelled this with a red face and slammed the door to the in-laws' living space. It seems she mistakenly thought that the house was in the in-laws' name, but I couldn't correct her. The children's behavior never improved. They would invade my office, disrupting my work. And the daily noise affected both my professional and private life, wearing me down mentally. Observing the children, I noticed something. Although they appeared well-dressed at first glance, closer inspection revealed untreated cavities and bitten, ragged nails, clear signs of neglect. Including their lack of discipline, it was evident that the sister-in-law was barely taking care of them. The in-laws, perhaps too fond of their grandchildren, did not seem to admonish them either. "Since your sister and her kids came, our lives have been chaotic. I'm reaching my limit." When I finally expressed my exhaustion, my husband disclosed his long-held concerns. Apparently, the in-laws had always favored the sister-in-law, and he had been continually neglected. Despite their pleasant public persona, which never revealed any family discord or their own disagreeable nature, they had always been regarded by others as a close-knit family of four. My husband moved out when he started working, and since then, the in-laws' demeanor softened, and they became kinder and more attentive. This behavior continued even after he married me, leading him to believe they had changed. However, their attitudes since we began living together were just like they were in his childhood. The in-laws doted on the sister-in-law while disregarding and even despising my husband. This attitude became clear when they accepted the sister-in-law's cohabitation. And my husband realized their true nature hadn't changed. It seems that whether we live with them or not determines how they show their true colors. They're kind to outsiders if we're not living together. But their real selves are shown once we start living together. I'm really sorry for not realizing this earlier and for making you suffer. With tears in his eyes, my husband apologized. His confession shocked me. To think that the in-laws who were so kind before we moved in were actually looking down on us with false pretenses all along. Although I had been vaguely sensing the recent attitudes of the in-laws and sister-in-law, facing the truth was still saddening. However, as much as he kept silent about it, my husband was also a victim just like me. I couldn't bring myself to be angry with him. Thank you for telling me. Steve, you did nothing wrong, so please don't apologize. Having learned the true nature of the in-laws, I felt a weight lifting off my shoulders. As if my perceived inferiority towards them had vanished. Since then, I secretly began preparing so that we could escape from the in-laws and sister-in-law at any time. A few weeks after Steve's revelations, on a holiday, while we were relaxing in the living room, the sister-in-law came up with an outrageous suggestion. It's too cramped where mom and dad are living, and the kids can't play freely. So, give us your living space. What? Are you telling us to leave this house? Shocked by her sister-in-law's unreasonable demand, both my husband and I were stunned. The sister-in-law then sneered at us through her nose. Oh, you finally get it even though you're fools. Yes, I'm telling you to leave this house. While I was at a loss for words, the mother-in-law came up from behind the sister-in-law. The place you two are living in is too big for just the two of you, isn't it? Giving it up for this girl with 3 growing children is only natural as a human being, right? Smirking thinly, the mother-in-law said that, prompting me to retort without hesitation. How can you say that? This is our home too, where are you telling us to live? I don't care, you could live in a storeroom. It would be just right for the two of you. The mother-in-law said dismissively, with the sister-in-law chiming in agreement. Faced with their behavior, I felt my patience finally snapping. I couldn't tolerate it any longer. I internally resolved that they deserved divine punishment for their selfish actions. And responded with an expressionless face. Understood, my husband and I will leave. However, leaving immediately is difficult. So please wait a week for our departure. In a week, we will leave as you wish. After saying this, I took my husband's hand and turned our backs on the cheering sister-in-law and her children. Once we were alone, my husband looked remorseful and apologized. Hillary, I'm sorry. I couldn't say anything. To my dejected husband, I revealed a plan. It's okay, I have everything planned out. Actually, my husband was surprised by my suggestion but agreed. We then proceeded with the preparations for moving, and the week passed. As mom and dad wished, we are leaving this house. In return, we will sever our familial ties with you and my sister today. The in-laws seemed indifferent to my husband's declaration of cutting ties. Yes, please do. A failure like you is no son of mine. Finally, the nuisances are gone. Now, this house is just for us. Looking coldly at the rejoicing in-laws, my husband and I left the multi-family house where we had been living. We moved into a rented apartment that we had arranged temporarily. In the quiet and cramped space, we began to live peacefully for the first time in a long while. A few days after the move, while I was working from home and about to take a break, I noticed a flood of missed calls from the in-laws and sister-in-law on my personal smartphone. As I was surprised by this, another call came in from the sister-in-law. I impulsively answered the call, and her yelling voice pierced my ears. What's going on? I got a call from the real estate agent telling us to vacate. You know something, don't you? What did you do? Indeed, since Steve had revealed the in-laws' true nature, I had been preparing to sell the house we were living in. I had quietly requested estimates from several real estate agents, selected one, and proceeded with the sale agreement at the timing when they declared to kick us out. Although the house was new and a multi-family home, its appraisal was low. But the land was prime property, so it fetched a decent price. Thus, I managed to recover a considerable amount by letting go of the land and the new multi-family house that I had inherited from my parents. That's not right. This house is supposed to be mom and dad's, how can you just sell it? Mistakenly thinking the house was in the in-laws' name, the sister-in-law was corrected by me. No. The house was built in my name, so it was truly my property. I was just renting part of the living space to Mom and Dad. Well, now it belongs to someone else since I've let it go. What? It appeared that the sister-in-law had put me on speakerphone, as I could hear not only her but also the shocked voice of the mother-in-law. What? This house wasn't in Steve's name. I thought it was, so naturally, it belonged to us, his parents. You deceived us, you liar. When you said you were leaving, normally, you would transfer ownership to us. What an unfilial and deceitful person. The in-laws and sister-in-law hurled insults and ranted. I dismissed them sharply. Deceived? That sounds terrible. The misunderstanding was yours. I merely disposed of my own property. So, please leave quickly. After saying that, I hung up on the still yelling sister-in-law and her family. Forced by the eviction notice from the real estate agent. The in-laws had no choice but to vacate the new home. According to rumors, after losing their place to live, the in-laws and sister-in-law started renting an apartment. But the children's mischief and noise led to numerous complaints from neighbors. The severity and number of complaints were such that the landlord couldn't remain silent, and they were evicted from the apartment in less than a month. Desperate and without a place to live, the in-laws shockingly stormed into my husband's company. Call Steve out. We are his family, we need to talk to him. In the company lobby, when the receptionist realized the seriousness of the situation as the in-laws made a scene, they discreetly contacted my husband while holding back the sister-in-law and her parents. My husband, upon receiving the message, confided in his boss and called the police, who then restrained the in-laws and sister-in-law upon their arrival. Steve showed himself only after the police had arrived. When the in-laws saw him, even as they were being taken away by the police, they fiercely resisted and shouted at him. You unfilial child. It's your fault we lost our home. Take responsibility. And calling the police, are you sane? How could you treat your family like this? Faced with their desperate cries, Steve responded calmly. I have no parents or sister. I had people who claimed those titles, but I severed ties with them a few days ago. You and I are strangers. I simply asked the police to handle some disruptive people in our company's lobby. What's wrong with that? What? Stunned by Steve's words, the in-laws were speechless. Meanwhile, the sister-in-law continued to berate him, crying out, "You traitor!" Heartless, until she was finally taken away in a police car. During the interrogation of the in-laws and sister-in-law, we met once with the sister-in-law's husband and his parents. They revealed that the sister-in-law was the one who had an affair, not her husband. Furthermore, the divorce had been initiated by him, but it had not been finalized yet. Due to this incident and the police involvement, the sister-in-law's husband demanded a divorce again and sued for adultery damages. Reluctantly, the sister-in-law agreed, and their divorce was finally settled. After their divorce, custody of the children went to the sister-in-law's ex-husband. He, with the help of his parents, disciplined the children strictly, and they reportedly turned into well-behaved kids. After being warned by the police, the in-laws and sister-in-law started living in a run-down apartment. It appears that during the time they lived with us, they spent extravagantly on luxury items while making us pay for living and utility expenses, and thus had almost no savings left. Unaware of this, the sister-in-law was furious. What's this? I wasn't informed. I was counting on your money for compensation and living expenses. Well, I didn't know about that. The divorce and infidelity were your doing. Pay your own compensation. You've brought this upon yourself. What did you say, you old hag? Even the in-laws, who had doted on the sister-in-law, seemed to have lost all patience. And now they argue daily over money. The sister-in-law, with no one left to rely on and struggling financially, reluctantly started working part-time. However, she seems to be causing problems at work. And it's likely only a matter of time before she's fired. Meanwhile, the in-laws' spending habits haven't changed. And they're living paycheck to paycheck without the ability to save. With their finances continuously dwindling, it seems likely they'll be evicted from their apartment soon due to unpaid rent. As we hear about the in-laws' decline through the grapevine, my husband and I used the money from selling the ancestral home and the duplex to buy a modest single-family home. Together, we're enjoying a peaceful and happy life.